welcome to my channel. Today I want to talk a bit more about my personal Japanese language studying journey. So I have been studying Japanese since May 2023 and I recently passed the JLPT N3 in December. For those of you who don't know, the JLPT or Japanese Language Proficiency Test is an exam for foreigners who are studying Japanese for them to assess their Japanese levels. Starting from N5 being the easiest and N1 being the most difficult, N3 is about the intermediate level that bridges the easier levels of N4 and N5 up to the more advanced levels of N2 and N1. The first tip I want to give you guys is to study to improve your skills, not to pass the exam. What I mean by that is, it's very easy when when you've booked your JLPT and you know it's coming up to just cram everything as much as possible and just keep drilling in the kanji, the grammar, the reading practice. While all of that is very important, that's not the real reason that we're learning the language, right? The reason we're learning the language is so that we can be able to comprehend it in everyday situations, to be able to listen or read or watch something and be able to talk to people and just to be able to apply that knowledge in everyday life. So study to improve your skills, because not only you can apply those skills to pass the exam, those skills will also be very helpful for you in truly being able to understanding and becoming fluent in the language and being able to speak to people, being able to read and watch and write without any trouble. Use the JLPT as a means of measuring your progress and seeing where you are in your language studies, and use it as a motivation for you to continue to study and continue to improve. Progress in a language is not linear. Sometimes it can be really hard to know whether you're actually improving, like you don't feel it at all. Your ability to use a language that you're learning will fluctuate depending on literally anything. So use it as a way of benchmarking how much you know in your target language, and then using that to continue to motivate you to improve. So, if you took the N4 this time and you passed it or not, then you know where you need to work on and when you will be ready to move on to the next stage. The second tip I'm going to give might anger a lot of people, but stop using Duolingo. And I'm serious. When I stopped using Duolingo and focused my energy on studying Japanese in other ways, whether it was through textbooks or immersion or flashcards, I felt my own Japanese ability soar so quickly. The reason I don't recommend using Duolingo is because Duolingo doesn't provide enough explanation for a language that is as grammatically complex as Japanese is. So Duolingo, yes, I actually used it for about 2 months in the beginning when I was studying. I do think that Duolingo is very helpful for learning the basic kana. So for you to learn all the hiragana and katakana, it can be very helpful because it's very repetitive in that aspect. But when it comes to grammar or vocabulary, there are far more efficient ways than using Duolingo. Duolingo doesn't teach you enough about how to hold a conversation and how to form your own sentences. When it comes to Japanese, a language that is so different from English, when you're having to constantly translate back and forth between Japanese and English, you're not really engaging your brain to form those new neural pathways for you to be able to form your own sentences in Japanese. What I mean by that is, we don't speak by constantly translating from one language to another. That's not what fluency is. Fluency is when you're able to comprehend and seamlessly speak or understand your language and be able to reproduce it without any trouble. When you're having to constantly translate back and forth, you're not actually helping yourself build your brain in using the language in that way. I think it's okay in the beginning, but especially as you progress, I found that I was plateauing so soon. I was plateauing so quickly after I was using Duolingo. You're better off investing that energy into a better structured learning course or method that will move you along much faster and way more efficiently than Duolingo will. It becomes way too repetitive because they're using the same 3 words over and over again. Yes, you do learn those 3 words, but if you're only learning how to use them in one context, you're not really building your brain to see them in other ways, because there's of course more than one way to use any word, and Duolingo is not really preparing you to encounter those words and being able to comprehend them in different contexts outside of the ones that they've provided for you. That brings me to my third point, the study materials that I used while I was studying for my JLPT. As a beginner, the first thing I started with, after I quit Duolingo of course, was I studied out of Genki 1 and 2 textbooks. I personally really enjoyed it and I found them really helpful because in the beginning, you don't really know what you don't know. Even though all the explanations are done in English, it's because at that level, you're not able to comprehend something if it's explained to you in Japanese. I like how they start introducing kanji to us right from the beginning so you can get used to seeing them. The structure of, reading example conversations and shadowing them. They do provide audios for you to follow along and repeat after as you go. The vocabulary is also very, beginner friendly, and as you're learning grammar and you read along through the textbook, right after each, so the structure of the book with example conversations, grammar explanations, and then it gets right into practice. So immediately after you've learnt the grammar, you can practice applying it as well as using those new words that you've learnt. Doing that helps to, as you're using it and applying what you've learnt, is a really good way of helping you to remember words. And on that note, this is like a third mini point, is to write your answers out. So don't rely on a keyboard, write your answers out, especially with a language like Japanese where there's kanji involved, there's different characters as well as stroke order. When you're writing them down, you're helping the characters to better stick in your memory, so you're able to recall them better and remember them. I would say in the beginning, you might, after you've kind of studied all the basic kana, it might be really difficult to remember them just by, studying and writing them over and over again. Once you start writing sentences with them, you will find that very quickly that you will start to remember basically all the characters as you are using them, because the more you use them, the more you'll be able to remember them. That's no different when it comes to, learning all the basic hiragana and katakana and basic kanji as well. So I recommend the Genki 1 and 2 for beginner level. When you finish Genki 1 and 2, it will take you to about a pre-intermediate level. It teaches almost everything you need for an N5 to N4 level. And then I found that going from N4 to N3 level, there's a bit of a jump from that. After I finished Genki 2, I moved on to Tobira Gateway to Advanced Japanese. So this one is an N3 textbook. I personally really like this textbook because it starts off in the beginning, it's a little bit easier. You start at around N4 to low N3 level, and by the time you get to the end of the textbook, you're looking at about high N3 to N2. The difficulty does ramp up as you go, and it contains a lot of reading material like articles and news, which are all going to do wonders for your comprehension. Especially if you're looking to take the N3 exam, I found this textbook to be really perfect for that because it had the perfect balance of not only articles and readings, it also had example conversations which you can shadow off of, and it has short response kind of questions which ask you about, the passage you've just read, and then you can write answers to them. The only downside is that there is no answer guide. So if you want to check your answers, the best way is to run it through with a native Japanese speaker or a tutor if you have one. It gets you used to using Japanese. And I found that my comprehension levels improved so much after I was reading so many articles and readings inside this textbook. It is a very dense textbook, so you want to take your time with it, but I can confidently say that if you can work your way through the Tobira textbook, you will definitely be well on your way to passing the N3 exam, but also you will develop a really solid understanding of how to use Japanese in everyday situations. Through the example conversations that they provide, you can learn a lot more about speech style. All the topics are related to different aspects of Japan. You're not only learning Japanese language and grammar, you're also learning about the culture and just all these different aspects about Japan, which really help to give you a more holistic understanding of Japan as a country beyond just the language. The third resource that I want to recommend is Anki decks. So Anki is a flashcard deck which you can use for free or paid. I have the paid one because I have a lot of cards. Basically, it goes by the spaced repetition system, which shows you words in like set intervals, and when you're seeing those words regularly and repetitively, it's inevitable that it will stick in your memory. What I did was, as I was studying through the textbooks, and whenever I came across new vocabulary that I either didn't know or a new kanji, I would add it to my Anki deck. On my Anki deck, I've got verbs, adjective, adverbs, that sort of thing. I also made decks for each chapter that I studied in Tobira. The reason why I love Anki so much is because the spaced repetition is so helpful for remembering and learning new vocabulary. You learn to recognize what a certain kanji looks like. In the beginning, it shows you a word that you don't know more often, but as you start to remember the words, it will increase the intervals in which it shows you the words. It helps you retain the words because once you go back to seeing it, you've already memorized it, you've already acquired it, so it just shows you after a while to refresh in your memory to ensure that you don't forget the words. Basically, spaced repetition helps you learn vocabulary a lot. Moving on to the last resource that I recommend is to install a good kanji dictionary. I have this one, like a kanji jisho app. Sometimes when you come across a kanji and there's no furigana on it, you're like, I don't know how to read it and I don't know how to pronounce it. So when that happens, you can just write that kanji into the app and it shows you the meaning of the kanji as well as all the different ways that it can be read. This is super helpful. This has been super helpful for me in reading articles and light novels, or when I'm watching a show and characters say something that I've never heard before. Once you've found the word and you've observed how it's used and its meaning, you can just add it into your Anki deck and keep reviewing it until you memorize it. Moving on from study resources, my next tip for you is focus on immersion over finding the perfect material for your level. What I mean by that is try to absorb the language whenever you hear it. Don't dwell on how much you don't understand. Focus on what you do. When I was first starting out, and even now, I absolutely hate watered down baby materials like children's books, picture books. I would recommend even to immerse yourself with material that is above your level. The reason I say that is we are way more adaptable than you think. Even if you find that you don't understand most of what you're listening to, whether it's like a podcast or a show, the more you listen to it, as you are studying of course, the more you will be able to comprehend what they are saying, because your brain is forming those new neural pathways where you don't have the time to simply stop and think about what you don't know, It's helping you to respond faster to the language. Say you're listening to something that you understand 95% of. Yes, it's great to understand most of it, but because there's only 5% that you don't understand, your space to learn and grow is not really all that high. It can be helpful in the beginning if you want to start with more easier content, but I personally found that from using higher level content, I was able to adapt to that level and sort of grow into that level much faster than when I stuck with content that was at or even below my level. Don't be afraid to not understand everything that you're immersing yourself with, because the point of language is to learn what you don't know, right? So make the effort to push yourself because you are more capable than you think. Your brain will be able to adapt to more advanced content before you know it. My fifth and final tip is to do practice exams around 1 week leading up to the actual exam. Try to focus only on revision because in this time, you're likely stressed and nothing is going into your brain. So focus on what you do know and do it well. So that way when you see it in the exam, you know how to tackle the situation, you know how to manage your time. Before I took the exam, I heard a lot of people telling me that time management is super important in the exam. It didn't really make sense to me until I got into the exam room and I realized like these people were right. Thankfully, I had done so much practice in the lead up to the exam. I had already created that exam condition and time constraint for myself as I was practicing. You really don't have all that much time to stop and think. As you're reading the question, you already have to be thinking about the answer, if that makes sense. That's when all the immersion and all the practice exams come into play. If you've done a lot of that and you're already prepared for it, you know, by the time you get into the exam, you're already able to respond fast enough when you see the question to be able to form your answer already. Especially for reading comprehension and the listening section, you really don't have any time to waste at all. There's plenty of listening practice exams that you can do on YouTube. You can do the ones that are structured exactly the same as the JLPT, where they play a tape and then you're meant to respond in that time before they move on to the next one. So that will really help to build up your ability to respond quickly under those exam conditions. And secondly as well, in the reading comprehension too, you really do not have time to read the entire passage, read all the answers, and then go back to the reading to figure out the answers. To be honest, I was the most worried about my reading comprehension because in my practice exams, I was only scoring like 40%. But when I did my JLPT, I was so surprised to find that it was actually my highest scoring section. I think because I did so much practice in the lead up to it because I was so worried about it, that's probably why. What I did was, instead of reading the entire passage first, I read the question and the answers first. And then based on the questions and the answers, sometimes some of the answers you'll find don't even make sense. So by process of elimination, you know, you can just eliminate the answers that you know are definitely not the case. And once you've narrowed down to around 2 to 3 answers, then you can sort of go back to the text. You can look for the keywords that you've spotted in the question and the answers and see where they come up in the text. You can then look back at the answers and determine which one makes the most sense based on what you've just read in the text. For each set of questions for each text, it's basically rinse and repeat. Next question, you know, you read the question and answer again. Most likely it'll be in the next paragraph from the previous questions paragraph. And then from there, you can just search for those keywords again, see where they come up and what they are talking about. So in that case, you're not reading the entire text, you're only reading those few sentences which contain the answer that you need. Same with the, I think, grammar section, is that what it's called? Where they give you like 4 lines and you have to figure out, they put a star on one line and you have to figure out which word goes in that line, and they give you like 4 and you have to choose from them. In that section, what you can do is, when you look at where it's placed, you don't even have to figure out what the words mean. Don't worry too much about forming the sentence and trying to comprehend the sentence. What you can do is instead look at the words, determine what type of word it is. Is it an adjective? Is it a noun or a verb? And then when you see where the star is on that sentence and those lines, you can then determine and order the words like, oh, okay, if it's the last word of a sentence, it's probably a verb. If it's, you know, the first or second one, it's probably the subject or an object. You know, based on the words that they give you, you can just try to arrange it into a sentence. You don't even have to understand it. Don't worry if you don't. Because if you can arrange the sentence into a structure that makes sense for the Japanese language, then it makes answering that section much easier. So that's it for all my tips for how I studied from 0 to passing the JLPT N3 exam in 7 months. To summarize, to study to improve your skills in the language, not just to pass the exam. Use the exam as a way of benchmarking your progress and seeing where you are in your language journey, rather than using the exam as an end of all means. Because the exam does not have a speaking section, passing the exam does not prove your ability to speak or understand the language. As you're improving all of your language skills in Japanese, that will translate over to your ability to perform in the exam. My second point is to get off Duolingo and use a more structured study method. So find what works best for you, whether it's with a textbook, and which textbook as well, or following an online course, or hiring a tutor. I would recommend a private tutor, by the way, because they can really help you focus on your areas of weakness and how to improve, and all of their focus and attention will be on you. My study method was to start with learning all the basic kana, then moving on to Genki 1, and then Genki 2, and finally onto Tobira when I started listening to more podcasts, watching more shows and anime. At that point, I had built up enough of an understanding to start making sense of native content. It was just about improving my comprehension skills, which was what I was practicing. My third tip is to focus on immersion rather than finding the perfect level of material for you. Instead of focusing on content that you understand 95% of, which only leaves you 5% to grow, try to learn from something where maybe you only understand about 60, 70 or 80% of, because that way you've got more room to grow, and as you're putting yourself in a more difficult situation, you will be amazed at your brain's ability to adapt and to step up into a higher level. You're stepping out of your comfort zone like that, and as you're doing that and you're staying there, you're expanding your comfort zone, and then once it's expanded, you're taking the next step and then the next step, and then your comfort zone is slowly growing and growing, which in turn, so is your Japanese language ability. My fourth tip is to make flashcards of all the new vocabulary and expressions that you come across. I recommend a digital flashcard app like Anki, which has an inbuilt spaced repetition system, and you can review as many or as few cards as you want, and it's so easy to do. You can just do it in like 10 minutes while you're sitting on the train instead of, scrolling on TikTok or Instagram, or, before bed, you can just review a couple of vocabulary. And my final tip is start to do practice exams at least a week before the actual exam. A month or so would be best, because you're giving yourself enough time to get used to the way the exam is structured. They definitely don't give you a lot of time to complete the exam. So by completing and practicing the exam under exam conditions, you're setting yourself up to be able to actually finish the exam on time and not to crack under pressure, and be able to, do the best that you possibly can and be as prepared as possible. So that's going to be it for my first video about my Japanese language journey. Let me know if you have any questions about my own personal journey, or if you want to talk about your own. Let me know what else you would like me to talk more about, whether it's more study materials. I do have a couple more videos coming up about this as well, so stay tuned for that, and I will see you in the next one. Bye!